it out of camera.
Oh, you need a shot.
That's quite formal, right?
I kind of need it in the shot.
So announcing your candidacy today.
If you'd like before, especially with the fintech focused,
Yeah.
I thought I'd do like a little bit of background on who we are and what we're doing.
Okay.
Which
Yeah,
I can
think
do.
maybe it's better for that.
Okay, camera rolling. Camera rolling.
Okay. So I'm just talking to you the whole time.
Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe you can, if you want to start like introduction.
Sure.
Yeah, just tell us something about it.
Michael Schlein, I'm the CEO of Axion. We're a global nonprofit dedicated to creating a financially inclusive world. We started in 1961, largely as a private sector Peace Corps, which was quite extraordinary because the Peace Corps had not yet been created. In fact, one of our founders went on to run the Peace Corps. We started in Venezuela, and we were doing community development. And then in Brazil in the early 70s, we said, our clients need more than community development, they need capital. We started making very small loans to the poor. We found they could repay 97% of the time. Dr. Yunus was doing it in Bangladesh, others were doing it in Southeast Asia, and it was the beginning of microfinance. Axion built nonprofits in almost every Latin American country and helped to make small loans to the poor, and we helped grow them, taught them methodology, taught them how to manage their risk, until 1992, when we created the world's first for-profit bank focused on the poor, Banco Sol in Bolivia. Up until 1992, all of microfinance was done by nonprofits all around the world. After 1992, the commercial model really took off, and it was controversial then. It's sort of obvious today that all of a sudden you could tap the debt markets, all of a sudden you could tap the equity markets, you could hire talent in a different way. Banco Sol was regulated in a different way. Later on they could take deposits. And Banco Sol had been doing very well as a nonprofit, but it really took off as a for-profit. So Axion went back to all those nonprofits and recreated them as for-profits. And that's when we discovered the power of harnessing the capital markets to make the world a better place. So then we helped to build some of the great microfinance institutions, first in Latin America, then around the world, including Banco Sol in Bolivia, Mi Banco in Peru, Compartamos in Mexico. We expanded to several countries throughout Africa, India, China, the Philippines, and most recently Myanmar. More recently, we've really been focused on fintech venture capital investing. Our mission is still the same. We're trying to reach 3 billion people who live in or near poverty and lack access to, or have really poor access to, the global financial system. To do that, you need to harness the capital markets. You also need to harness new technologies. We're, as a nonprofit, set up to take risks that others aren't willing to take. And over the last several years, we've built out something called the Axion Venture Lab portfolio, which is probably one of the largest portfolios of seed-level investments in fintech for inclusion. And these are the most innovative companies in the world. It's very, very exciting. We're living in a very disruptive period of data analytics, the Internet of Things, machine-to-machine technology, biometrics, psychometrics, global satellite imagery, all of which are changing all of our lives, but have enormous impact on how we can meet the financial needs of people who have been left out. So we find, support, invest in, and work with some of the most innovative companies around the world, and I can walk you through a little bit of what we're seeing, everything from new models of insurance, new models of how to reach farmers and help smallholder farmers, new models of how to reach small mom and pop shops and give them the capital they need to grow and thrive. That's the seed level portfolio. We also work with later stage companies, same thesis, fintech for inclusion, and we created one of the world's first global fintech fund for the underserved. A fund that is, and what we're trying to do with the fund is show that you can have a great impact and also have great returns. And if you can do that, that's how the capital markets work. Capital will come into this sector. So same thesis, and you see a bunch of incredibly innovative companies, and we can talk about the companies and the trends that we're seeing. But just to give you the full range of our work, we also work all around the world with licensed, regulated, deposit-taking institutions, microfinance institutions and banks, and that are aiming to serve the financial needs of 3 billion people. Almost all of these are on a journey to use new digital technologies to expand their reach, to reach segments that haven't been reached before. We also, just so you have the full scheme, we also have a team of about 60 people today called our Global Advisory Solutions staff. And what they do is they go around the world and they get hired by these institutions to advise them on how to deploy new technologies. This is a frightening time. It's an exciting time, but there are so many new technologies. And if you're the CEO of an existing institution, you don't want to make a mistake. Yeah. So we specialized in understanding the financial needs of the base of the pyramid and understanding the new technology. So we're well set up to advise CEOs and CTOs on technologies that can allow them to achieve their mission better. And the last part is we've created the Center for Financial Inclusion, which is really a global think tank focused on the issues of what are the obstacles and what are the solutions to achieve a financially inclusive world. And part of that work includes the creation of the world's first global consumer protection campaign, the SMART campaign, which we're very, very proud of. It is over 100 institutions, and they are among the best institutions in the world in over 40 countries, have adopted the SMART campaign principles, the 7 campaign principles, which really has defined how you must deal with the most vulnerable people in the world. And this has become the standard for institutions around the world. In addition, we work with the Economist Intelligence Unit, and we rank over 50 governments around the world on how they're doing financial inclusion. We also work with the Harvard Business School to train leaders around the world. So it's a think tank, and of course we produce a steady stream of high quality research. So that's the background. All of this is in service of our mission of trying to create a financially inclusive world.
Yeah, really thank you for the introduction. It's really helpful. So in your introduction, we should say that I heard like 2 important concepts. First is technology, right? And second is, could you say the SMART campaign principle or the customer protection? So maybe we start from these 2 concepts, because in China, the financial inclusion has been more and more important topics these years, especially when there's attention from the government. So I think from government side, what they pay emphasis on first is the SME financing, because they want to use the technology to help SME financing. But there's actually a very serious problem in this area, especially in China. We often say that SME financing is first, it's hard to get one, and the second is very expensive. So do you think this is a worldwide problem? Or is there any successful model that has already solved or made contribution to solving this problem?
Yes and yes.
Yes? Okay.
Yes, it is a worldwide problem. It is an enormous problem. I do think the world has figured out a banking system that works for the rich and for rich corporations. And increasingly, I think we've figured out how to reach some of the most poor people in the world. But there's a huge, huge missing middle of small mom and pop shops, small SME businesses that banks do not know how to lend to, and it's very, very hard. They tend to be informal. They tend to be in a cash world. They tend to mix their personal finances with their business finances, all of which makes it very, very hard to understand what's going on in the business to determine if they're creditworthy. The worst thing, credit is a very powerful tool. It can open up enormous opportunities. It can also drown someone, and it can be quite harmful. And in many cases, you don't know till after the fact. So what you really need to do is find the right size loan at the right time for a small business. But the second part of your question is it changing, and are there models out there? And we are seeing some new models that I personally am very, very excited about. Harnessing data and data analytics and some of the new technology, we're seeing several companies that are finding new ways of figuring out the needs of small businesses. Confio, I was with them last week in Mexico City.
Confio.
Konfio.
Okay.
And I'll give you all this in this.
Oh, yeah.
Confio uses 5,000 data points to assess the needs of small mom and pop shops. And then with that data, they can lend faster than any bank ever could, and banks in Mexico don't lend to this segment. So they are now the fastest growing online lender in Mexico, and they are reaching a segment that has not been reached before. Another company, Lydia, in Lagos, Nigeria, they provide a free digital invoicing tool for small mom and pop shops, and then once they help move that company from cash to digital, then they can see precisely what kind of loan that business can sustain, and then they start to lend. We've seen a lot of very terrific innovation. Subk is a company in India that uses small mom and pop shops to reach out to the last mile, and they provide a set of tools, and they're reaching populations that banks would never serve. Tienda Pago is another company, also in Latin America, that is leveraging supply chains, working with fast-moving consumer goods companies, so milk distributors, beer distributors, and they basically use the data from the consumer goods store to know who they can lend to, because they can see, it's information, they can see how much is being sold through the store. The key thing here is these small mom and pop shops have been invisible. Mm-hmm. And today, with data and data analytics, we can make them visible. And once we can make them visible, we can lend to them.
Yeah.
Can I just interject? I think it may be interesting context for your audience. Mm-hmm. The SME finance issue is very important globally, and that's one reason Michael is in the steering committee for the World Economic Forum on financial inclusion. Mm-hmm. Yes. He's meeting at the World Bank on that next month, and in 3 weeks he's at an SME Finance Forum with the World Bank and the IFC on a panel with Ant Financial, Unilever, and MasterCard. Mm-hmm. So this is a issue to policymakers and officials globally, and not just China. Mm-hmm. So everyone's working on it.
Where will be the forum?
The SME Finance Forum is in Amsterdam.
Amsterdam. Oh, okay. Okay.
And we can send you some background on that.
Okay. But we talk just about technologies, but how about interest rate? Because in China, like, government wants to lower down the interest rate for this SMEs. But someone said that it's you cannot achieve two goals at the same time. Like, you cannot just provide very cheap loans, and at the same time you want to provide as much loans as you can. So what do you think about this problem, about the price and the accessibility?
So we're a deep believer in harnessing the capital markets to change the world. Frankly, much of our work is supported by philanthropy, but ultimately we're trying to build scalable, sustainable, commercially viable, successful institutions that will really service not just SMEs, but basically consumers that are left out as well. To do that, you need to build a strong, stable company, which means that it's got to be able to cover its costs. So we're believers in charging interest rates that allow a company to grow and thrive. Those rates can be different in different markets. Globally, microfinance interest rates are in the low 20s. And that has allowed, but there are different markets that have higher interest rates. It really is a function of the markets themselves. You can't just look at the interest rates. You have to look at the whole market to see if there are reasonable interest rates. The most expensive loan is the one that's not made. I'll tell you a story of a client that I met, a woman named Ana Lucia, who used to spend half of every day going to the market to get material to make a single dress. And if she could sell that dress, she could bring home money, and she could bring home milk and food for her children. We gave her a very small loan. With that loan, she could buy materials 2 weeks at a time. All of a sudden, she's in two things happen. One, she's in a new business. She's now selling material to other women like herself. But most importantly, we gave her half of every working day back, where she no longer has to spend the time traveling back and forth to the market because she could buy the materials in advance. How much would you pay for that loan?
I think as long as it is lower than my, revenue, I can earn money if I can.
And certainly the return on her investment for that loan was incredible. More importantly, and it's hard to understand, it's a lot easier to lend out, to make one big loan than a lot of small loans. But if you're really trying to, and that's why the banking system doesn't work for 3 billion people. It's much, much harder to make a lot of small loans because the administration is the same. And so the expense for the small loans is higher.
Okay. Yeah, that's true. But in China, the government wants to try to make the big banks, especially the 4 big banks, do these things, and they provide really, really low interest loans for SMCs, like 4%, something like that. Yeah. Do you think it's, I mean, they have already sent out some loans, but some people will criticize that it's not market. Yeah, it's not market oriented. What do you think about it?
I think that is well intended, but ultimately I don't think that will succeed. I think if you are forcing banks to do things that are not in their long-term interest, they won't do it well, and it will distort the market.
Yeah.
Again, we're seeing innovation about companies that are finding new ways of succeeding and scaling to meet the needs of SMEs and people who are left out, and they're commercially viable, and they can get to this is what they want to do.
Yeah.
It's different when you force a bank to do something it doesn't want to do. We've seen this all around the world, and frankly, ultimately it doesn't work.
Yeah, but are there any examples like big banks could do this small financing?
So what we've seen in Latin America, for example, is banks trying to get into this segment and failing, and then retreating. And then more recently, they've realized that what they should do is acquire a microfinance institution, but then manage it separately. So the problem is when a big bank tries to go into this sector or acquire something and then tries to merge it, it doesn't really work. The cultures are different, the systems are different, the whole incentive structure is different. But we have seen a few examples around the world where banks are now acquiring microfinance institutions and managing them under a separate brand as a separate institution. And that actually does work because then these microfinance institutions can leverage the bank's lower cost of funds. We're also starting to see some exciting innovation of mobile network operators acquiring microfinance institutions. And again, you need to manage them separately because the cultures of a mobile network operator and a microfinance institution are too different to work well together.
Yes, that's true.
Now that said, the notion of regulators encouraging banks to lend into this sector is terrific and very, very important. And rather than try to do it themselves, they can lend to institutions who specialize in these segments.
Yeah.
That's worthwhile.
So that's also something like China wants to do, that like you have some companies, like say using mobile tech, they're not cooperate, but they will help the banks, to have some loans to these sometimes consumers, sometimes are the SMEs.
Yes.
We call it assisted lending.
Yes.
Yeah. This model is really, really popular in China these days, but mainly in consumer finance. A very small portion of companies are do this in SME financing. So what do you think about this model, like this?
So we are seeing this all around the world, where the innovation of fintech companies is joined with the institutions of existing banks. And if you can put those two things together, it's very, very powerful. If you can get the innovation that we're seeing in these small startups and combine it with the scale and client base of the large institutions, those partnerships, that is how we will change the world. So we're very excited by this. And it used to be just a few years ago that people thought the fintechs were going to battle the banks and that it was going to be a fight to the death. I think that has changed completely, and I think it's all about partnerships. Now, these partnerships are powerful, but they're also very, very hard. When you have a large institution trying to work with a tiny little startup. The cultures are very different. The incentives are very different. We wrote a report maybe 2 years ago on partnerships like this that are working. And it was one of the most popular reports that, from our Center for Financial Inclusion, it was one of the most popular reports that came out because everyone is trying to figure this out. Mm-hmm. If you're the small fintech startup, you dream about partnering with a large bank. And if you're a large bank, you say, wow, this innovation is so exciting. How do we do that? So the partnerships are the key to the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but actually in China, we see that those banks who apply for this model is a small, medium-sized banks because they don't have data, they don't have technology, so they have to seek help from these